Hi, I hope you're all having a good conference so far. My name is Łukasz Hacura, and I'll be talking about impact of virtual reality on game development. First, a few words about me. I started as a gameplay programmer in a company, believe it or not, called Fresh Chicken Studios. Then I went into lead programming and production at CI Games. And 2 years ago, I co-founded Anshar Studios, where I strive to be a creative director at a virtual reality dedicated project called Detached. So, you may ask why I'm doing that. I have absolutely no design background, and this is a design track. But actually, when it comes to VR, I will try to explain that right now, nobody is an expert. There's a lot of chatter, a lot of discussions, a lot of good practices coming out of 50-person focus test and stuff like that. Basically, we don't know how to do a good VR game yet. But at this lecture, I will try to explain what it means actually to create a virtual reality dedicated project. And if somebody out there is thinking about integrating virtual reality into their project, or starting a virtual reality project from scratch, he will have a better understanding of what he's up against. To add some context, I would like to say a few words about what our project is about. Almost 2 years ago, when I first have a DK1 on my head, I said, okay, resolution is bad, latency is high, I feel nauseated, VR is going to be awesome. I knew it back then, and I know it now. So I was looking for a project that an indie studio with an indie budget can create, okay? We are 20 guys. I can afford maybe 5-6 person working full-time on Detached. So we need to scale our project. What can we actually do that is cool, but it's an indie project? And in October 2013, I had an epiphany. I had this total original idea about a chick or a dude that has some problems in space and is doing stuff and flying around. So we took this total original idea, and that's how idea for Detached was born. It took me a few months to gather a team that was dedicated to create it, and we started working in February 2014. Right now, we are after 3 prototypes. We started development with Unity, but after GDC 2014, we switched to Unreal Engine 4, like many studios did back then. And right now, we're creating a vertical slice. And after 14 months of development, I think that now we have a pretty good idea of what we actually want to do and what creating a VR game means. So what the game is about. The PR line is exploration and survival puzzle sandbox first-person experience dedicated to be played using a VR headset. What the game is actually about is about chick or a dude flying in space, doing stuff in VR. And for the purpose of this lecture, this is enough information for you, okay? Because this presentation is not about Detached. And why we are on a subject of what this presentation is not about, it's also not about programming optimization tricks. We at Anshar Studios have a strategy of taking tools as is. So it's up to guys and girls at Epic, at ATI, at NVIDIA to do the low-level things, to optimize the code so that the VR implementation is better and smoother. It's also not about AAA VR game creation. Nobody out there is creating, trust me, nobody out there is doing AAA game dedicated to VR. There will be many integrations. Like last month of development, somebody will say, hey, let's add VR to our game. And they will do it, it will suck, but basically that's how AAA VR creation will be for a while, until we'll build up a user base enough that somebody will actually decide to throw $100 million at a VR dedicated project. And it's also not about mobile game VR. A lot of the stuff I'll be talking about you can use in mobile. But when you do mobile VR, like Samsung Gear VR or Virismo, Seymour, and all those stuff, those other devices, you need to consider a lot more. You need to consider battery life. You need to consider heating. You need to consider that there's higher latency, lower FPSs, worse tracking, etc. So you cannot apply all the things from stationary VR to mobile VR. So okay, finally, I won't try to convince you that VR is awesome. It's enough for me that I know that. So what the presentation is really about, it's about trying to convey the 14 months of our experience of things that we thought that we knew how to develop, but it turns out that VR changes a lot. Most of the development we did on Oculus DK2. We started with DK1s, then HD prototypes, and we're hoping that soon we will get crescent base, but anybody who knows how the situation there's like 30 units in the world, and 3 of them are in Epic at NVIDIA and 27 at Oculus. So it's very hard to get a crescent bay right now, but we're hoping. Okay, first, so that everybody could be on the same, let's say, level, a few things that is common to everybody that only started to work with VR, okay? How to achieve spatial immersion and how not to break it in VR, because VR is the only way you can create a video game and achieve presence, okay? You can have a lot of types of immersions. There are designers that could explain it better than me, but spatial immersion, meaning that I think that I'm actually in there, this is something exclusive right now to VR, okay? Because normally, you're not looking at the world through a 50-inch window, right? You cannot feel that you are inside the game when you're looking at a TV screen or looking at a monitor. But you can actually feel that you're inside the game when it's VR. So, but how to, it's very easy to break that feeling, break that immersion. First of all, quite obvious, you have to have a very smoothly running game. Your latency shouldn't be higher than 20 milliseconds, meaning that using current technologies, you have to have 60 frames per second per eye, which means usually that your game needs to run 100 plus without VR to work comfortably on VR. So that effectively cuts out many things we're doing right now, right? Like Assassin's Creed Unity barely has 30 frames per second. So they don't gonna get VR integration anytime soon. Another thing, you always have to have a freedom to look around. Now I want you to think about it a second. The player always has to have a freedom to look around and also not only rotating himself, but tilting using head tracking, right? So this kind of moves anytime during the game. So you cannot force him to look at one particular spot. You cannot do a cutscene that forces a camera to look at one particular spot. And this is a big design change on almost any game, right? But this is something you have to do, because immediately when you take away camera control, when the player feels that when he's moving his head, nothing happens in the game, the feeling of presence is immediately broken. Second, the UI should be a part of the virtual world. So it also breaks immersion if you have a sticky, like in normal heads-up display in games, like in your left corner or somewhere. It should be a part of a virtual world, like a pop-up 2 meters before you or something like that. And a hard one, very hard one, is you should limit acceleration. Our body can feel acceleration, right? We can feel the gravity. We can feel in a car if we are accelerating or deaccelerating. Now, we cannot feel speed. We can observe speed, but we cannot feel it. But we can feel acceleration. So having a high speed inside virtual reality is quite fine. We don't get nauseated. We don't get confused. Our inner ear is fine with that. But if you accelerate or deaccelerate, and let's say a rule of thumb is more than 0.1 g, like a city bus acceleration, then at least 20% of people would get nauseated. First-timers to VR. That's also important. Most of the stuff I'm talking about right now, it's important for a comfortable experience to a first-time VR user. That's a thing that you hear very common right now. Reading anything about VR, any press releases. For Oculus, it's very important to have a comfortable experience for a new user at VR. It's very important to have a comfortable experience. But you actually can get used to it, but I'll get back to that later. So, the limiting acceleration also narrows down much of the design choices. So actually the best VR experience is you are not moving, sitting down in your chair and looking around, right? Now that doesn't exactly sound like a very exciting game. Okay, what kind of games work well with VR? I'm sure that everybody who's thinking VR, the first thought is, okay, first-person perspective. It's like obvious, right? First-person perspective is the best genre, like first-person perspective shooter, for example, for virtual reality. Well, actually, it's not that good. And especially if you're walking around in your game. I mean kind of a shooter game or Skyrim, not simulators, not flying or driving around a car, but when you are walking. Because there is additional dissonance for your brain thinks, okay, I'm walking, but I'm not walking. I'm sitting, and I'm using my WSAD keys or a gamepad to move around. And the inner ear, again, gets confused. You can get nauseated very easily. And actually, I don't see that we play Call of Duty in virtual reality anytime soon. It's not the best genre for virtual reality. But if you have something that your relative speed to is 0, like a point of origin that you can relate to, and everything else moves around, your brain takes it much better. So I called it cockpit-based first-person perspective. It can be like you're inside a car, or you're inside a cart. Many demos are inside a cart on a roller coaster, right? Or you're in a spaceship. Now, our brain can handle it much better because it's okay, I'm sitting, the spaceship is moving, but I'm not. Maybe it has, I don't know, initial dampeners that doesn't allow me to feel acceleration. But your brain accepts that very well. One of the great examples of implementing that is Elite Dangerous. They have a very good VR integration. As you can see, the UI pops up. It's a part of the virtual world. We are sitting down in a chair like we do in real world, and the action takes place outside our spaceships. So how can you do that in a free-to-play game? Sorry. How can you do that in a first-person perspective? This is a short movie from Detached where we are flying around in space using jetpack. So we don't have a spaceship around us, but we have a spacesuit. So what we did is we simply allowed the helmet to be a part of the suit that is not moving with the head. The head moves inside the suit. And it actually has exactly the same effect as the Elite Dangerous thing. And the nausea effect is much less occurring in that configuration. Now, something that may be counterintuitive, but virtual reality works really great with third person. Because in third person, usually you are a silent observer, okay, of the action. So you're like a ghost, you have no body, you're just a camera flying around in the world, observing some stuff. And apparently, our test shows, plastic test shows, many companies that are doing that, is that our brain accepts not having a body much better than having a body that it feels awkward, we have no control over it, etc. So actually, that doesn't limit you to any particular genre, right? Because if you can be an observer, you can observe anything. You can observe a platformer, side-scroller, real-time strategy, like watching over your minions as a god or general or whatever. So actually, you should not think about a genre in terms of VR because I think there are no limitations. What you should think in terms of VR is what kind of a camera control will I have in my game? because it's always going to be actually first-person perspective, right? Because if you're a ghost observing an avatar, or you are an avatar, still, it's a first-person perspective camera. You can look around. You have head tracking in all the games for VR. So what are good practices for camera control? I already mentioned two of them. Always having a point of reference and never taking away camera head control. But also avoiding uncontrolled spins. That's something that we did a lot in Detached at first. Imagine you're flying in space, you have this virtual body that can collide with things, with bulkheads, with meteors, with whatever. And if you apply correct physics to it, then you start rotating in all the axes very quickly. And this is a very discomforting thing for many people in VR, especially newcomers to VR. So what we did in our second prototype is we faked rotating physics. Basically, we're dampening them. We have special physics materials, so all the collisions with the player are actually like 10 times softer than they are in reality. For the player to be able to, like when he bumps into something, he doesn't immediately go into uncontrolled spin. What we're not doing is we're not doing the acceleration thing, because we did that and the game was boring. Basically, when you're flying around in space in a jetpack, you want to feel cool, right? You want to explore it, you want to do fun stuff. And when your maximum acceleration is 0.1 g, it becomes really boring, covering the distance in space. And of course, it's not nauseating, but we made a decision that it's better for 80%, for 20% of people to get nauseated, but those 80% are having fun. So now we have more like a Quake-style movement. It's very dynamic, high accelerations. And actually, we have a pretty good feedback about steering, but those 20% will need to train on other VR games before trying Detached. Another thing is avoiding rolls. Surprisingly, our roll rotation is the rotation that we handle the worst as human beings. We can handle pitch, we can handle yaw in virtual reality, but if you do this that you can see here, on the screen, then again, 20% of people will say like, whoa, okay, I cannot take it, and they will take off the helmet. So in many, many cases of good practices for VR is avoid roll rotations. Don't do that, because your inner ear goes crazy. But on the other hand, for those 80% of people, this is one of the coolest features, okay? Because this is something, okay, I'm feeling something, I'm excited. So what we decided to do is we are cutting it out from the tutorial. So we are adding the roll feature later in the game so that the newcomers won't have it in the first few minutes of the game. But we're not going to take it away. Another thing that is, it's not particular for virtual reality, but for space simulator virtual reality games, is that people love to have a point of reference. People love to know where up and down is, and roll is something that screws that up, okay? You can't believe how many times when talking with focus test subjects, I needed to explain that in space there is no up or down, okay? Everybody was asking, I don't know where up or down is. And the problem in it was actually in our level design. Our level design, it was in space, a base near an asteroid, but it was very horizontal. And actually, when you saw it in editor in Unreal Engine, you could clearly see, okay, here's up, here's down. There's the buildings, there's the landing pads. And people immediately have it stuck in their head that they want to know where up or down is. So what we did is we just broke it, okay? So now, there are no rules. There's chaos. We can do buildings 45 degrees, 90 degrees, whatever. Just don't do the horizontal thing so that the people won't think that there actually is up or down. But that's just for space games. What we're about to do, we haven't got around to it yet, but there are a couple of very interesting techniques out there. One of them is putting a virtual nose in your game. There was a study in a university in the United States that it was University Department of Computer Graphics in Purdue. What they did is they added a virtual nose to a hardcore roller coaster experience. I mean hardcore, that high percentage of people needed to take off the headset before throwing up. And they added a virtual nose to it, and actually they improved by about 20% their, reduced by 20% the nausea effect. So people could stay longer in the game for about 20% of the time. And actually, apparently it works like a real nose, meaning that after a time, you don't see it. The brain cuts it out, like with the real nose. So it can be a free way to improve the comfort of the gameplay, but we're about to test it. The second thing is that is used usually in walking controllers in first-person perspective is use spotting for yaw rotations. When you're walking around, turning, so the yaw rotation is also accelerating. And when you walk around, not flying, but walk around on your feet in virtual reality, it also is quite nauseating, like a dancer that is doing spins, right? So you use technique, used spotting. It's a dance technique, actually, where a dancer tries to spot one point in the, somewhere in the room, and she turns her head very, very fast, and the body follows. And that's how she doesn't get dizzy. So the implementation of this in a video game is that your rotation are instant. So when you do on your game controller, you like, okay, I want to rotate left, you rotate immediately by like 45 degrees, for example, or 30 degrees. So in those jump motions. And it looks awkward on the outside, but actually inside the VR experience, it's more comfortable. This is something that we're going to add because we have actually walking around when you use magnetic boots on flat surfaces in detached. Moving from camera, I want to go to art. Now, and this is a tough subject for me. I'm not an artist. I usually argue with artists a lot. The problem with cinematic experience in VR is, what's a cinematic experience, okay? Many games right now strive to be a more cinematic experience. You can hear that. And I'm not meaning the bad way, not the quick time event kind of that this is more a movie than a game. I'm talking about art, about techniques like lens flares, blooms, focal blurs, decals on the camera, like raindrops or blood. And this is usually those cool effects. This like, yeah, it feels like a movie, okay? And why is it cool? Why we want to be more like a movie? Because when you play a video game, you cannot have a sense of presence, as I said before. You're looking to a virtual world through a 50-inch or 27-inch 16 by 9 window, right? And the most familiar thing when you're doing this is watching television, because you watch the television the same way. So usually the players have this wow effect, like, whoa, this is like watching a movie, if something cool happens on the screen in terms of art. Now in virtual reality, it's not the case anymore, because in virtual reality, you actually feel like you're inside. And if somebody starts to showing effects on the screen, simulating that you're watching the world through a digital camera, then the immersion is actually broken. So you shouldn't do stuff like this, and you shouldn't do stuff like this. And of course, we know that it's very popular right now, right? Lens flare simulator 2014. So, but the bad part here is that artists won't always agree with you, okay? Artists loves the lens flares. Artists will always say, yeah, but it looks cool. Immersion, but it looks cool. And some battles you will lose. Your art director will hate you for you that you say that he should not do it. But at times, it will look like this. So this is actually a scene from Detached where you're waking up from a concussion. So because of the concussion thing, I allowed it. It's a very cinematic experience. But usually the game is very crisp. The next thing is showing your body parts. Adrian Chmielarz, in his blog post called Surprising Immersion Killers in Game, 5 Surprising Immersion Killers in Games, argued that showing your body parts, especially hands, in first-person perspective games that are not shooters is an immersion breaker, because you see this virtual hand that is doing something and you have no control over it. Well, I not only agree with him, but I can say that in virtual reality it's like 10 times more that, okay? Because you have this feeling of presence, and then you see this hand. It's not your hand because your hand is on a gamepad or on a keyboard, and the immersion is immediately broken. But I know that there are companies out there that will try to force it. I mean, for example, I don't know if you saw any demos of Project Morpheus. Sony has tracking on the gamepads, so they're hooking up the gamepad tracking to the animation system, so you have this semi-hand tracking, but still, for me, this is a very big immersion breaker, and I know that this might look cool, and this looks awkward, but in virtual reality, it actually feels okay, okay? This is a scene of art gathering something. There are no hands, you just press a button. Because in reality, you press a button on a gamepad, right? So you don't see your hand in front of your face. Another thing is, you can never take away camera head control. I already mentioned that. But that also includes head tracking. You should not never turn off head tracking. And it can end like this. Here, a guy is standing up and moving 1 meter away from his chair, not moving using the input. It's just head tracking, right? So how to avoid that? How to avoid a guy trying to penetrate every wall with his head? And as always, you cannot take away camera controls. You cannot check collision and stop him, because his head moves, but the game stops moving, we break the immersion. So what can you do? We actually ripped off Alien Isolation on this. Alien Isolation also has virtual reality integration, unofficial, for DK2. And what they do is they allow the player to move out of the helmet, but they darken the screen out. They do it gradually, so there is no like this suddenly in it. You can freely move your head around, so the cardinal rule is still applies here. And it actually doesn't bother you that much. It's like, okay, my head is too far. Okay, I'm going back. So we will black out the screen, basically. A tricky subject is, many people discuss this, how long can you spend playing a virtual reality game, right? Because you have a heavy headset on your head, your eyes can get a little bit pinchy at times, itchy. You can get a little bit maybe nauseated. It's more tiresome than normal gameplay, that's for sure. So when DK2 came out, people argued that you can play comfortably for 1.5 hours using DK2. But then some people say, okay, but Crash and Bay and the new Morpheus are more comfortable, you can play for 2 hours. I actually have a friend who played 4 hours straight in Alien Isolation, which breaks like 75% of rules I just mentioned. So most people would throw up in it, okay? And he played it for 4 hours. And there are people who are spending 10 hours straight playing Elite Dangerous, which actually have amazing VR integration. But it's easier because of the genre, right? You're flying in a spaceship, so it's like natural for VR. So what I would like only to say is that you cannot say that on average your player will play your game this time and this is comfortable, because for every player it's going to be different. But what you need to do is implement in a design a way for him to take a break almost whenever he wants to. Because you do not want your player to be playing your game and like powering through the pain, you know, like, okay, I want to stop, but the checkpoint is like there, my head itches, everything is like uncomfortable, but I'm powering through. That's not the kind of experience you want for the players. So try to implement your game the way that at least you can like pause like at any time without any problems, and have checkpoints and save points often, that the session length can be ended almost any time. Now, the interesting lesson I learned from creating detached is that sound is important. I know that sound is important in every video game development, but I would argue that in virtual reality it's twice that important. And I know that because we paid twice that usual in implementing cool sound, cool 3D sound in detached. The immersion, the sense of presence when you do really good 3D sound is really amazing in VR, and you can appreciate it much more than a normal video game. So even if you are an indie studio, consider that you will need to spend a little bit more money to get, well, maybe not a AAA, but close to that of sound quality in your game. Now, you never can take away camera head control from the player, right? So you have no control over how he's playing your game. He can stare at one point the entire game. He can be turned around. You have no way of actually forcing him to look somewhere. Now, for example, this is how a sample gameplay of a prototype of detached takes place. The speed is 4 times for the effect. As you can see, the girl is using like the whole capabilities of VR, right? Looking around, turning around, using head tracking, and everything. So right now, she almost has her back to the actual gameplay. Now, for us, this seems normal, right? She just turned on a chair. But what the game actually thinks? The game actually thinks that her body is forward, only her head is tilted backwards, right? We were even thinking about breaking the player's neck if he did that, but eventually we did not implement that. But that's a problem that you need to consider in your game, that you cannot force a player to look in one particular direction. And for example, when we had a meteor shower, we wanted to have this very cool scene that a meteor shower comes in front of the player, and one meteor, few meteors are near misses, and of course one hits him, right? 70% of players had no idea what hit him because they weren't looking in the right direction. And you cannot actually predict that in any way, because even if you start a meteor shower in the right direction, he can turn in like half a second and everything goes to hell. So you need to remember that. Also, you need to remember that the gameplay can look like this. Now, this is also 4 times speed, so over a minute of gameplay, and the guy doesn't even flinch, okay? So try to incorporate in your games some kind of encouragements, especially for hardcore console players. If you put a hardcore PC or console player in front of a VR, he will just do what he is familiar with, right? He will look forward and play the game. They're very good with gamepad controls. They're not getting like nauseated usually. Everything's fine, but they're not moving their head. They're not taking advantage of the hardware. So also in your game design, try to, well, maybe not force, but encourage the player to move his head around and not his body using the game controller. When you do we did a lot of focus tests on detached, and the one thing that makes me crazy is when someone is going to an event like GDC or Gamescom or whatever, he stands in a line with 70 people to watch the new Crescent Bay or new Vive or whatever, new Morpheus, right? And you have like 5 seconds to get the thing on, the queue is very long, and everything is blurry, it's uncomfortable, and you say, yeah, VR is useless. VR is, no, this is not the future, right? Well, no. VR is actually a very personal device, okay? You need to calibrate it. You need to have the proper distance from lenses to your eyes. For example, I wear glasses. It's very important for me. You need to configure your straps properly. It's very easy to have an okay-ish experience that when you look straight ahead, it's crystal. but you only look more to the left or to the right with your eyes, and it's blurry. And it's not because it's the fault of the hardware. It's the fault of adjusting the hardware to your head. So when you do focus tests, or when you test the VR yourself, always take a couple of minutes to adjust it so that it's a comfortable experience for you. Now, I mentioned comfortable experience a lot of times today, and because this is something that manufacturers of every VR, Sony, Valve, and Oculus, are very hard on us developers, that they want to have a comfortable experience. Because they're, and I understand that, they're afraid that if they will put out the hardware, then many people will get sick, get nauseated, it will have bad press, bad reviews, a lot of return rates, and this is something they don't want to do. But actually, when you play a lot of VR stuff, you get used to it more. You're not going to get nauseated so quickly. And like Oculus admits that. I mean, this is a quote from their guidelines for developers, that you shouldn't be a test subject because you are less susceptible to being nauseated. Well, why am I less susceptible? Because I play a lot of VR games, right? So what I'm afraid is that we will have a lot of games that are a guy sits in a chair and looks around. And that's it, because that's the most comfortable VR experience, okay? I argue that we need to have also games that are a bit of a more hardcore VR experience, so that for the players who are familiar with VR, something actually is still fun for them. So what we are trying to do in Detached is, first of all, have a VR learning curve incorporated into the game. So the game doesn't have like too much of extreme VR experiences at first, but we will add that gradually as the player will be more comfortable with the steering scheme, with the game, and with the VR. We will spice things up. And second of all, and I think the most important one, you should have some type of separate difficulty settings for VR. How hardcore of a VR user am I? That's the question you need to ask the user, okay? So that he maybe he's very new to VR and he's very susceptible to becoming nauseated. Maybe all the accelerations should be 0.1 G. Now that, of course, puts a lot of work on the design side, right? Because all your timings, all your distances get screwed up because you have different speeds of movement for different settings. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it's something that you need to think about. Now, on the last note, if I would ask you to take away one thing from my lecture, is that I don't believe in VR integrations, okay? And there will be a lot of them. Every game, every AAA game, or most of them, will have VR integrations. And it will be like Move integrations done like month before certifications. They will be like adding another control, like joystick or something like that. Programmers will rush it, and the experience will be very, very poor, okay? To integrate VR, there is so much things you need to consider that you need to do it almost from day one, okay? Or at least take a couple of months to change a lot of things inside your game to be able to have a comfortable and nice and good VR experience. There are, of course, exceptions. If a genre of the game accepts VR automatically, like, for example, Elite Dangerous, right? This is a game like automatically created for VR. They didn't need to change like almost anything to have a comfortable VR experience. But for example, if you want to have a first-person shooter, then you need to change a lot. And I don't think we're going to see that in a couple of years, I think. Okay, this is just a gist of it. I hope that if anybody out there is interested in VR, you can take something from that. If you want to download the presentation, here's the QR code. And if you have any questions in terms of VR, there are many companies in Poland that are talking actively about VR. There's Plastic, there's the Farm 51 with the Reality 51 project, there's us, Anshar Studios. We are all very open and sharing in terms of that VR experiences we have. If you have any questions, please reach out. And are there any questions right now?